Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our session today. Um, it seems like there seems to be a little bit of an echo on my end, but I'll try to be quick so we can get to the presenters. The focus of our today's webinar is on child abuse and neglect, which certainly is a problem that exists in our society, and the lasting effects of child abuse and neglect impact children's ability to learn and their emotional state. So we do have some good presenters here today who will share a lot of information on this topic. And we hope you'll be able to take away some tips and suggestions that you'll be able to implement at work or in any work that you do, whether it's at the program level or your consulting or training staff. So this webinar is being brought to you by the Source for Learning. Here at SFL, we are committed to growing and empowering early childhood educators, and we offer support for practical learning and implementation of beneficial strategies in early childhood program settings. SFL is an established online creator, compiler, and curator of high quality learning assets for almost 40 years. And as part of our ECE initiatives, we bring these free webinars and we have an online administrator credential for early childhood educators here in Virginia. So here is our control panel. You can certainly chat with us and send us messages during the session. And we will, if there is a question for any of our presenters, type that in. We will respond to you from time to time, and also at certain points, we will have the presenter respond to your question. We also have a handout section on the control panel, so that's where you will be able to get your handout for today's webinar. Let's get social. So if you're on social media, share about our webinar on Facebook as well as on Twitter. So here are our presenters of today's webinar. Toni Kakachi Bashirs. She is our SFL board member and retired CEO from Children's Harbor in Chesapeake, Virginia, and an adjunct professor at Tidewater Community College. Alan Gutman. Alan has served in leadership, management training, and teaching roles in early care and education programs for 39 years. And he was a professional consultant and contributor to a standards handbook for prevention of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and exploitation, which was published by Arabian Child in UAE. And as a former director of public school district, private nonprofit, and Head Start early childhood programs, he has developed and implemented child abuse reporting policies and procedures that protect children and mandated reporters. Carrie Scruggs, she is our SFL ECE consultant. But besides that, she is a volunteer guardian ad litem for Wayne County in North Carolina. And these volunteers are appointed to cases where there is suspected or confirmed child abuse. Now, typically one takes on either one or two cases, but Carrie has, right now she's working with 8 children who have been abused or neglected, and she's helping them find permanence. And Carrie has helped until now about 13 children. So assisting today's presenters is myself. My name is Kamna Seth, and I'm the Senior Director here at SFL. I oversee the ECE initiatives. And I have along with me my colleague, Shireen Ali, who is an education specialist and part of the ECE initiatives team. With that said, I will hand over now to Tony, who will share the objectives of our webinar today.
So today's objectives are to try and understand the different types of abuse and neglect, and also to recognize the physical and behavioral indicators. Want to learn more about mandated reporting, and then finally to gain some strategies to meet the needs of the abused child and support their families in that role. So from that, we're going to go to the next slide and just start with what does some of the research tells us? That for a long time, we have neglected the study of maltreatment because for decades, social workers, clinicians, lawyers, and others have documented the pain of child victimization, but there's been obstacles that inhibit the scientific study of this topic. The nature of the subject itself is emotionally overwhelming. The field lacks consistent definitions and valid instrumentation. Data collection efforts are cumbersome and often unreliable. And then there's always that presence of multiple cofactors in the study, things like poverty, violence, and other forms of victimization that makes it exceedingly difficult to isolate some key factors. Next slide. But in the last 3 decades, there has been some remarkable progress. Theoretical assumptions have been revised and expanded to incorporate research findings about characteristics of not only individuals, but also families, neighborhoods, social and cultural values that affect child maltreatment. The importance of the developmental cycle of the child has been recognized in studying the consequences of such maltreatment, and also in how we design interventions and prevention programs. And then there's the relationship between the experiences with child abuse and neglect and a broad range of other health and behavioral disorders that has been explored through longitudinal studies with increasingly larger samples. But despite this progress, we still lack a solid base of research that can guide and enhance society's efforts to intervene and prevent child abuse and neglect. And so this is where Alan is going to talk to us about the different types of child abuse and some other information.
Thank you, Carrie. Good afternoon, and I thank you, or good morning to some of you. I thank you all for taking time to attend today. I'll first say that the reason I'm bald is because I've worked in early childhood for 39 years, but I see that as a great thing. So let me share with you, there were 4 boxes there on the objectives, and 2 of those boxes related to defining child abuse, the types of abuse, and then also looking at the physical and behavioral indicators of child abuse. While those occupied 2 of the boxes, they're going to probably only occupy about 5 minutes of my presentation today. My focus today is most importantly on reporting of suspected child abuse and the key role that you as mandated reporters play in that process, and the importance of what I call connecting the dots between when we suspect a child may be the victim of abuse and the reporting of that so that some action can be taken to protect children. So on this first slide, you see physical abuse and physical neglect and sexual abuse and emotional. These are the larger categories of child abuse. Next slide for a little more detail. And these are the broad definitions in terms of physical abuse. You know, we expect to see a lot of types of injuries, in physical injuries in young children. We hope that we see some of that. It means that they're exploring being active. it's when we see certain types of injuries and the explanation for those injuries just don't make sense. There's not a reasonable explanation or rationale for why a child has some kind of a burn on their back, for example. What I will say about my training as well is I'm not going to be showing you pictures today. But I will be providing you just some information on what some examples of these are. Will be on the next slide. But just going along, sexual assault and exploitation, and a lot of times pornography is now no longer in magazines or even static still photos. Most of this is now online. It's in videos. Is where we might see sexual abuse taking place in addition to sexual abuse that's occurring physically directly with the child. Neglect is examples are malnutrition. It may be just not having proper attire on for the weather, and then emotional maltreatment. And again, this is sometimes hard to define, and I just kind of look for patterns of types of behavior that a child is being emotionally exposed to versus one incident of some kind of might be emotional trauma. Certainly one emotional trauma could be significant enough, but a lot of times I'm looking for a pattern of emotional maltreatment. Next slide. So again, these are examples. I'm not going to read through all of them, but it's possible a child might get burned. It's harder to explain why a child has cigarette burns all up and down their back. And again, I encourage you, if you haven't been required to by the program you work with, or if your program hasn't been required to, at least on an annual basis, attend a training where you're getting up-to-date information on how to recognize some of these symptoms and indicators of physical child abuse, as well as some of the behavioral indicators we'll look at on the next slide. But again, it's not just seeing one bruise. Sometimes it's seeing just a myriad bruises on a child's body and seeing different levels of discoloration, which would, tell you that these are injuries that are happening over periods of time, multiple periods of time. And again, some examples of neglect. And sometimes unattended medical conditions, we do get into a little bit of questions around religious preferences in terms of what types of medical treatment can happen. That's generally not what we're talking about here. We're talking about really situations where a child is so sick and not being treated, not getting the proper care for their illnesses or injuries. And then also some of the examples of what one might see when a child is being sexually abused. And again, we don't always have the opportunity to see some of those examples of sexual abuse, but sometimes we do when we're working with young children and we're changing them if they've had an accident or they're very young and we're changing their diaper. It may be that we see some symptoms or evidence. And again, these are behavioral indicators. And I will repeat again, and I'm not going to read through all of these, and you'll have the document there to refer to. But what's most important here is that you see a pattern or you see multiple indicators that that you're becoming aware of that the child is exhibiting in your program, either at home in a home-based program or at your center. So again, it may be that a child may be withdrawn. It's not just that they're shy. It's the idea that, they're not engaging with the other children. They're not engaging with you, along with just other maybe patterns that maybe makes them look fearful. And again, with sexual abuse, some of these indicators, again, it's looking at the cluster of these indicators and not always looking at just one indicator. Like example, with promiscuous behavior, children are naturally curious about their bodies. They're naturally curious about other children's bodies, and we don't want to stigmatize them for that natural curiosity. It's when we see repeated types of behavior that really show that they're being exposed or they're experiencing themselves some type of sexual behavior or sexualized abuse on a frequent basis in a way that they're having to express it either on themselves, with themselves in your programs, or on other children. Often that's the way you see this promiscuous behavior when they're exposing other children to what they're experiencing. Next slide. So I always say, you know, we learn a lot from the numbers, and we learn why being a mandated reporter is not just something that we legally have to abide by, but we have to understand that we work with populations that are the most at risk for abuse, for violence being committed on them by adults. So it's important to take a look at what those numbers look like and why our role again is key to helping children be protected so that these numbers should go down. 696,000 substantiated cases of abuse, of maltreatment. One case is too many, and I always like to say when I do my training, if I've helped one person to learn and make a report where they suspect child abuse and one child gets protected, I've done my job. Next slide. And again, why I say we're important in terms of the children we serve, especially in early childhood, when you look at the numbers birth to 5 and you look at the victims by their age, we're talking over 50% of child abuse, of substantiated cases by victims, over 50% are children that we serve. So we're going to be the ones that probably are going to be the most likely to suspect when a child is being abused. And I'll just stop and pause for a second. If there's any questions, again, reminding you, as Kamna shared, you can enter them into the chat box, and they will pass those along to me or ask me those questions as well. And I just want to check, are there any questions up until now? And again, think of them along the way. If something occurs to you, I've said something that you're wondering about and you'd like me to try to address, please go along and chat that to Kamna.
Right now, there are no questions, so we will certainly forward it to you as soon as we get any, okay?
Great. Thank you very much. Next slide. So this is our worst case scenario, and this again is why we play a vital role in protecting children. There are, quote, only 1,368 maltreatment fatalities. And again, one is one too many. But when you look at this chart here, 84% of fatalities as a result of a child being abused, that's in children from birth through 5. So it's essential for us when we suspect abuse, and sometimes we'll see or we'll suspect repeated abuse. It's very important for us to intervene as soon as possible to make that report so that the child can be protected as soon as possible. If we wait, we suspect and we wait, who knows if by waiting we ended up giving that child or giving the abuser an opportunity to abuse the child so badly that the child dies at the hand of abuse. So again, it's really important that we look at how serious this is for us in our roles as mandated reporters. Next slide.
Alan?
Yes, Kamna.
Alan, before we move on to the next slide, there's a question here, perhaps you can respond to. Are these stats for Virginia or the entire U.S.?
Okay, so this comes from the national. This is at a national level. So in the previous slide of almost 700,000 substantiated cases, that's from a national survey of abuse that was reported by the states. This again is also a national level survey. And again, the way I've developed the training, while there's individual statistics for the states that can be found in that reference that's cited at the bottom of the document, that is the handout, you can find your individual state's statistics in that same document there that I'm giving you the national statistics for. Good question. I see a question also in the chat box about center-based versus regulated care. So what I'm going to say is these statistics are not indicating abuse at the hand of child care providers. these are just referring to children being abused, and we're going to find out very shortly who commits most of the abuse on children. But if that's what the question was pertaining to, whether a child is in regulated care or whether you serve in regulated or unregulated care, you are still a mandated reporter because you are caring for children. Generally, state law will not differentiate between whether you're in a licensed facility or an unlicensed facility. You're serving children, you're caring for children, you are considered a mandated reporter in any law in any state. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kamna. So again, most of us fall into this category of early childhood educators, caregivers, but also mandated reporters may include healthcare practitioners, doctors, anyone working in a child protective agency, and commercial film and photographic print processors would refer to pornography mostly, but I would imagine now that category could be extended to video or media producers or online posters of material, that if you're posting material on your website or you have an open website where material gets posted, I think you would also be subject to being a mandated reporter if people are posting material on your site and you know who those people are, and if the pornography is of young children or children younger than 18. Next slide, please.
Ellen?
Yes.
There was a video here. Do you want me to show them the video?
Yeah, that's great. How much
Okay.
time do we have, Kamna? I just want to do a time check.
We are good on time right now.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
I have so there is a quick question here which was pertaining to stats. So perhaps I should just go ahead and ask you that question now, and then we can show the video.
I'll try to answer.
All right. So the question is, do you know why 6 to 7 year olds have a big amount of child abuse? So we did see that number did jump up. I mean, it was, kids younger than 1 was pretty high, and then it kind of went down, and then there was a jump for the 6 to 17 year old. So would you know why that would be?
Well, I'm not sure what you're saying in the 6 to 17. Maybe if you could go back. And actually,
let me go back.
I have the slide, so I can take a look. Are we talking about? Well, the jump is that I've grouped 11 years together. That's why there's a jump. In the birth to 5-year-olds, those are each individual. 679 is just for infants alone. That's one age category. The 6 to 17, that jumped to 206. There's 11 age categories within that one statistic. So if you broke that out, if you broke it out, it would be a much lower number for each of like 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds would each be a much lower number. This is combining 11 age groups together.
So the younger the kids, the higher.
Yes, the younger the higher individually. So like 5-year-olds, there's no statistic like between 6 and 17. There's nothing that rises up to 36 children dying from child abuse. There's the highest number is clearly with the young children. But again, if we looked at each of those 6 to 17-year-olds, maybe in 6-year-olds, maybe 20 children or 15 children are dying from child abuse. Again, those numbers for individual years would be much lower. But again, this is combining 11 age groups together.
Okay. All right. I'll move on to the next slide and
actually, could you actually go back 1 second, Kamna? I just want to point one other thing. I want to point one other thing out.
Okay. Go ahead.
So when you go back to that slide with those statistics in the fatalities, again, it's 84% overall of the fatalities are in children birth to 5. There's only a little over 15% are in children from 6 to 21 years old. So it's much larger in those younger children. All right, now you can go back to the video.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Created a safety net. And And that safety net is all of the providers in the world. And that's all the moms and dads and all the policemen and firemen and all the teachers and all the social service people and all the physicians and nurses and other practitioners. That safety net is really there so that the child won't fall through the cracks.
If these children are in any form of danger, if these children, whether it's abuse, whether it's neglect, we have the responsibility to protect these children.
Okay, next slide. Thank you. And again, just other examples, some specific examples in the area of education and social services. Next slide.
So the next slide is a poll question. So the question is, what is your primary job role? So those of you who are participating this afternoon, and your choices are going to be teaching staff in either a classroom or family home setting, an administrator, which makes you a director or manager, those kinds of roles, a mental health, social service professional, other ECE support staff, so you may be a cook or an education coordinator, and then other. I'm going to take a minute to go ahead and answer that question. If you would please do that online, so then we'll have our results. So what is your primary job role? All right, we'll give you about 10 seconds to finish up. What is your primary job role? So how would you classify yourself? All right, we're going to go ahead and finish this up and look at the results. So 42% of you are teaching staff and 27% are directors, but then we also have about 14 that are either other support staff or health, mental health, social services, and then 17 that aren't listing themselves in the early childhood field or mental health, social services. So Alan, I'm going to turn this back over to you with the next slide.
Great, thanks, Shireen. And actually, could you leave that up a second? Or if not, okay, thank you. And I'm going to also, for the people that were other, just if you could chat into the box there, and not that I'm going to go through every title, but I just want to get a sampling of what some of those other job roles for people that entered other. So for teaching staff, that largest group, you are the people with the closest working relationships with children on a daily basis. You're going to be the ones that more than the others in this group will be the ones that more than likely will have some suspicion of abuse if and when that's occurring with one of your children. So it's really important that you see your vital role as a mandated reporter on a daily basis. For administrators, some of that may apply to you in terms of your relationships with the children. However, I would also say to you that a major part of your role is ensuring that your staff feels supported, feels safe, feel like information when they're sharing about suspected child abuse within your program, when they have to file a report, that they feel like they're being supported by you and that you're implementing policies and procedures where they feel protected and supported in that role. Again, healthcare professionals, health professionals in programs, mental health, you may be providing support to your teaching staff as well, to your mandated reporters, in terms of when they have questions about their suspicions, number one, even though they are individually responsible, mandated to report. But they may come to you to ask questions, or you may provide some help with their own. They may have their own emotional concerns with having to file a report. So your role can be in that role as well. I see military school liaison officer again. Again, you're working with your staff, with your administrators, with your families as well. So you play a key role also there.
Right, and we have some folks from the public library, recreation coordinator, training coordinator at the county level, quality coach. So these are a few who fall in that other category.
Yeah, and I would say that even for a public librarian, it's if your primary job and your role is working directly with children, and specifically, let's say you're the children's librarian. To me, I see that your role there is working directly with children, supporting children. If you see something that you suspect may be abuse, I could see where that might be mandated. Again, the law may not specifically designate you, but the reason, again, kind of the answer on this to my own question that I put up there is, again, because you're working with children on a daily basis, that's why you're mandated. It's a rather basic answer, but it's essential. And I think sometimes families, even society in general, doesn't see the responsibility that educators and early childhood caregivers have in having this mandated role. It's in the law. Not computer engineers are not. It's not mandated in law. So again, we're in a profession where we have a mandated responsibility that's very serious. Next slide. So this is fundamental research that was conducted by Gail Zelman, and though this is from several years ago, what she was trying to look at was how consistently or inconsistently mandated reporters reported child abuse. And this goes to a key part of my message and presentation today, which is ensuring that we understand, number one, our role, but number two, that we also not bury our heads in the ground with our teachers, with our mandated reporters, and just not understand that there's going to be some concerns, there's going to be some fears, there's going to be some barriers and challenges when we have to file a suspected child abuse report. In Gail Zelman's study, she classified people as consistent reporters, which were every time someone suspected, they always reported abuse. Discretionary were people that they were mandated, and sometimes when they suspected abuse, sometimes they reported, sometimes they didn't. Then there were some people in her study where every time that they suspected child abuse, they never reported. And then we have people that never have been involved, they never suspected child abuse. Next slide. So we have mixed news on this slide. The good news is that 44% of mandated reporters in her study that suspected child abuse consistently reported that abuse, consistently followed the law and carried out their role as a mandated reporter. The bad news is that we have to combine the 33% who are the discretionary reporters, meaning they sometimes did, sometimes didn't, with the 17% who consistently didn't report. That gives us over half, 50% of the people that participated in this study that were mandated reporters, they either didn't report all the time or never reported. So the way I interpret that is they suspected abuse, the child needed to be protected, and yet they didn't file a report. So that child, in those cases where they weren't reported, was not being protected by people that are mandated by law to make sure that a report gets filed. Next slide. Again, this speaks to who does the mandated reporting. And again, it's mostly in our profession of education personnel, child care providers, social service personnel. I've worked in several Head Start programs, and all of these job categories are within a Head Start program. We have all of these job categories. We also have health and mental health personnel as well. And occasionally we not occasionally, we also have medical personnel that are in Head Start programs. So it could be larger than 20. If you're a Head Start program, a larger percentage of your staff than what's indicated in the types at the top three there could be mandated within your program as well, and who does the reporting in your program. Next slide. So here's the disturbing information in terms of that question that came earlier, which I'm assuming someone was wondering whether I was talking about abuse in centers. That's not what I was talking about. Basically, if you look at that bottom number, 91.4% of abuse of children was committed by their parents. So when we look at, I've talked about this for years, and maybe some of you grew up with stranger danger and all the programs and curriculums that we had on teaching children about stranger danger. Well, when we talk about the world of child abuse and the area of child abuse, it's not stranger danger. It's people that the children are very close with, that have relationships. It could be other relatives besides the parents. It could be close friends. But it's in less than 9% of the cases is it a stranger that's putting the child at risk for abuse or that is abusing the child. And when I talk about our role as mandated reporters, we can see that parents are not the ones reporting child abuse. Again, most of the time, they are the people committing child abuse. And I don't want to, I don't want to ostracize parents here. That's not my role. I'm just talking about a very small subset of parents. It's the parents, it's the people that abuse children, and it's the parents that abuse children. Most parents, loving, caring, but when a child is being abused, oftentimes they're being abused by their parents. Next slide. So these are the larger areas of why we report child abuse. And I think we always, from a personal perspective in our field, we work with children, we care for children, we want to protect children. So I would say my first motivation for always reporting child abuse when I suspect it is that there's some kind of intervention, that there's some kind of assistance provided. Yes, there are legal and professional requirements. Many jobs, teaching jobs, early care and education jobs require you to sign a form at the beginning of your employment or at the beginning of each program year that says that you understand your role as a mandated reporter and agree to carry out that legal role. Next slide. And again, these are some of the more specific examples of reasons for reporting broken down by the different categories. So while there are variations, most of the states in terms of the child abuse reporting laws that are on the books, most states make it an individual responsibility at minimum to report to the authorities, whether that's Department of Social Services, the Department of Child Protective Services, whether it's the police. Sometimes it's any or all three of those that you're required to report to. In some states, you not only have an individual responsibility to report to the authorities, but you also have an individual responsibility to report to the supervisor, your supervisor, or the owner or director of your program. Sometimes a program has its own, sometimes some states, and again, these are becoming few and further between, where the only responsibility in the law was to report it to your supervisor or director. And I will give you the worst case scenario of this. The child abuse reporting law in Pennsylvania, up until the time of the scandal at Penn State University, was that the person in that case that suspected abuse, the law said all they needed to do was go to their supervisor. In that case, the person went to Joe Paterno. That was the person's supervisor. Joe Paterno, he went to his supervisor. He told the president of the athletic department, the director of the athletic department, who then told his supervisor, the director of the university. None of them reported it to the authorities. But within the law, one would say that, well, at least the president of the university's requirement was to report it. Everybody else reported it to their supervisor. And again, that law has changed now. It's an individual reporting responsibility so that it doesn't get lost amongst the supervisor and you don't know whether the supervisor reports it to the authorities or not. Okay. And in some states, you may or may not be required to provide your personal information. Usually, as a mandated reporter, the state wants to collect your information and in terms of your identity and where to contact you. And part of that is to protect you, because if there's any further follow-up that needs to happen and they need to get information from you, this basically establishes that you are a mandated reporter, and most of the state laws actually have something that prevents you in the law from being liable for your reporting. If you report in good faith, if you do it not out of any kind of malicious intent, then you are protected by the law for fulfilling your role.
Great. Thanks for clarifying and providing that additional information and update, Alan.
And I want to share that piece on the bottom that may have been originally its own bullet is an example from the state of Maryland, where besides the mandated role, that's a separate part of state law in Maryland, there's also a separate law in Maryland that says that any resident who suspects that there's abuse of a child going on, that they also have an individual reporting responsibility, and they can do it anonymously. Okay, that's not for the mandated reporters specifically in the law, like teachers and doctors. But again, in Maryland, this is a separate part of the law that says all the residents in the state, if they suspect abuse, should report abuse. Next slide. So now we get to sometimes what comes in the way of people reporting, even when they suspect it. Again, going back to Gail Selman's study, why did sometimes people report, sometimes didn't other times? Or what did sometimes people never reported? And again, there are personal concerns. Sometimes people are concerned what's going to happen when they file a report. Sometimes maybe it's not a young child and they don't think it's something they need to report. And again, sometimes gets into the characteristics of the case or evidence, or they have concerns about how the system may respond. Next slide. So again, I think from a teacher's perspective, from an individual perspective, some of those concerns, they're listed there. But I think some of them, when I ask people about it, some of the main concerns are just being afraid that there's going to be retribution or retaliation. Sometimes we as teachers know something about the family. I've had cases where we know that the family has gang members, and we're concerned that when we file a report that there could be some kind of retaliation. That doesn't stop us from having to fulfill our legal role. We still have to fulfill our legal role. Sometimes people have had a bad experience filing a report. Either, something happened with the authorities, questioning them. Again, these are all the concerns. It's important that for the administrators, especially that are attending today, for you to understand this is from the study. These are real. These are the real concerns. And again, sometimes people have not reported because they thought that by reporting, they were going to put the child at greater risk. They're concerned that somehow the parent is going to retaliate against the child. So what I say right now is, all we do is we suspect abuse, we report abuse. We don't investigate it. We don't anticipate what the outcomes could be from an investigation. We don't anticipate what the outcomes could be for the child. That's not our role. The law doesn't empower us to start considering those things. So while we may have concerns about the effects, I'm not saying we deny these things. It's important for us to acknowledge that there are these concerns about the effects, but it's also important to differentiate them between leaving the police, child protective services to do their jobs. That's their role, not ours. Okay, next slide. And again, I get more on this slide. I focus more on the system concerns here. You know, when we talk about some of those people that answered Gail Zellman's study in terms of feeling like they were discretionary reporters, some of them said, or the ones that never reported, some of them said, I could do a better job myself. Why do I want to get the system involved? Well, number one, the law says that's not your role. Number two, the law says you're required to report. Okay, so while these may be some of your concerns, and we understand them, and I acknowledge them during any of the in-person trainings or live workshop trainings that I've done at conferences, while I acknowledge these concerns, I always bring people back to, you've got to be there to protect the child. And I guess we have a video on this page, Kamna?
That's correct, Alan. I will play it now.
Thank you. I can't hear it.
For many, the very thought of reporting is frightening. All too often, mandated reporters fail to take action due to their fears. Fear of being wrong, fear of retaliation, fear of liability, and fear that the child will be removed from the home. All are common among mandated reporters.
The fear factor certainly deters a lot of people who would normally file a report.
And I remember the first time I got a subpoena to testify in a child abuse case, and I was very frightened.
I can understand people's reluctance. They're unsure of the criminal justice system. They're not sure that anything's going to be done. They're concerned about exposing themselves to liability.
You have to get beyond your own fears, and you have to think about your responsibility to the children.
It's hard. It's scary. A lot of us worry about whether we're going to lose our license. Did we do this in anger? Did we do this in frustration? Did we do this vindictively? We go through all those things.
Forget the fear. Forget about being afraid to speak out for that child. That child needs to have someone protect them. The child is not strong enough, big enough to protect herself or himself. You have to be the one that says, I care enough about this child to take the risk. I care enough about this child to make this child's world a better place.
Yeah, so I like this video. It's a little dramatic. And someone had asked about getting, the video is online at YouTube, and you can find it. It's called Shadows to Light. So I saw someone had asked about that. So it's called Shadows to Light. If you search for that on YouTube, you will find the entire video. I will give you the caveat. It's from about 30 years ago in California. I just like the way a lot of the clips were done, though. It's dramatic. And I think the next slide is a poll. And let me just tell you, we're not individually looking at each person that's submitting these. We just want to get an idea of the answers to these questions.
The question is, have you ever suspected child abuse and not reported? And again, just trying to get a feel. We have no way of looking at you individually, just in the about 137 folks on this call. Have you ever suspected child abuse and not reported? So please select one.
Right. And if I had a follow-up poll, which is not going to be, I can imagine that some of the reasons were because of some of those concerns that I shared in the immediately previous slides to this. But it's understandable. The research says that there are people that suspect and do not report. If we see a small number here, that'll be refreshing information.
So we'll take another couple of seconds to finish doing this before we show the results. So please do go ahead and answer. Then we'll go ahead and wrap this up and look at the results.
So 18%, and what I will say is, I think Gail Zellman's study was looking at doctors, psychologists, as well as educators. I think within the field of early childhood education, I think I think a little bit more sensitized in our jobs to ensuring that we follow our mandate. But even amongst us, again, in that 18%, I'm going to say that I would assume that some of the concerns that I shared, whether retaliation, whether someone's going to share information about me with the family, concerns like that, concerns for my health, concerns for what was going to happen to the child. Are they going to pull the child out of my program? Is that going to be better for the child or not? I would imagine that those might be some of the reasons. Again, that 82%, that's a great number. Everybody in that category that suspected child abuse and that has reported, that's a great number to see. Yes, we'd love to be at 100%, but we know that there's a real world and people have concerns. Next slide. Thank you, Shireen. And now just trying to get a feel for the group that's attending today. Just have you ever suspected child abuse? Or, excuse me, have you ever reported suspected child abuse? So this will kind of tell me whether you've been, quote, involved in having to report or uninvolved. And we've got about close to 140 people participating today. So I'm kind of interested in what that number looks like. And the odds are the longer you work in the field, the more likely it is that you probably will have encountered some situation where you've suspected abuse.
So we're going to go ahead and get ready to wrap up this question.
Great, thank you.
And show the results.
Okay, so we've got 60% that have, quote, been involved. You know, so we're looking at about 70 or 80 of the attendees today have suspected child abuse. And I haven't gone into this today, but that word suspected is a key word. Our role is not to say that there definitely has been abuse here. When you saw that word on the early slide about the statistics with substantiated, substantiated means that it was investigated and they found that there was child abuse. That's never our role. Our role is not to substantiate whether child abuse has occurred or not. Our role is only that if we suspect that abuse has happened, that we report it, okay? It's not our role to investigate. So again, doesn't mean that there was abuse in every one of these cases, but it did mean that the 60% that took that poll were suspicious enough. They got a feeling inside, a gut feeling that I need to report this. Something doesn't seem right, or the child has said something that certainly sounds like they're being abused. And I believe we may be at my last slide coming up next. So for the administrators and directors, this is what I share with you as something that I implement in my programs. It may seem kind of simple, but one of the things that I find staff have the most difficulty with is getting confronted by a parent once a report has been filed. The report may not have even been filed by them, or it may have been filed by someone else in the program. But a lot of times the first person the teacher will go to, the first person that the parent will go to if child abuse is reported, the parent usually will go to the teacher first. They have a trusting relationship. And why I say that this is what teachers should say is that, again, going back to that trusting relationship, you don't want to lie to parents, but when a parent confronts you and says to you, are you the one that filed that report of suspected child abuse? Did you report me? Did you tell the authorities? Why did you do this? You don't have to lie to them. You just say, it's our policy. We don't share that information. I know many of you may think that's ingenuous, but to me, I think that should be the policy. It should be something that parents know from the minute they enroll and register their child in your program. It should be in their handbooks. It should be for any trainings that you provide to parents. Again, it should be in your personnel policies and procedures when you do staff trainings. I give an example. I had a team of 137 on staff in a large Head Start program in Los Angeles. I had teachers role playing on the stage where we were doing the training in a large room, and I had them role playing, one person playing a confrontational parent, getting into the face of a teacher, again, during a role play, and having the teacher say, no, we don't share that information. And the other part of this that I say is that you can also tell the parent, and again, for you directors and administrators as a good support, another part that you put in the policy and for your teachers to say is that we don't share that information. If you have any questions, please speak with my director. Please speak to my supervisor. Please speak to this administrator in our program. And again, that way, it lessens that one concern, number one, of betraying the relationship with the family, to lying to the family. And this way, you also feel like you have something that will protect you from having to disclose, because it's vital that when you file a confidential report, that information be kept confidential. Authorities years ago, 20, 30 years ago, used to share information with parents about, oh, this report came from this school or this report came from your child's teacher. Those days are gone. Hopefully they're gone. Every once in a while you hear some horrible story where it may still be happening. But again, for the most part, those days are gone, so that if you're confronted, you should be assured that your information has been kept confidential. Yes, the parent's going to know that abuse has been reported. It may not have even come from your program, but parents often will first go to their child's teacher or a caregiver as the first place. And if this is my last slide, I just want to check if there's any questions that have come in or any questions now.
Alan, I think you have a few more slides still.
Oh, okay. Maybe I didn't print out everything. I apologize. I think there may be some anecdotes here. Oh, I think you're right. I don't know why I didn't print those out. Okay. So again, this goes to the law and the mandate. And if your state has a policy where the only requirement is that you report individually to the authorities, then you could look at a two-part policy. This first part talks about fulfilling the legal requirements. And then again, if you have a state where that's the only part that's mandated, then I say that you also have a second part, which is the next slide. And the second slide is that often as an agency, you want to have procedures where you're aware that a child abuse report has been filed. So you may want to set up a team in your program. And again, why I suggest this process, there are examples, again, early from my teaching experience, where someone from another center came over to my center to report child abuse. And her concern was that the person she was reporting on was the daughter of the director of the center. So that's a case where it's very hard. It's easy to follow the mandate of reporting to the state or to the local officials. It's a harder responsibility to then say you're going to report to your supervisor if the supervisor is the parent of the abuser. Now that's why I'm giving this example. It's a real life case. But again, you may want to set up a team of people so that even if there's someone in the program who knows the person that's being reported on, that information can be kept from the person that's working in your program who may be a relative of the suspected abuser. So again, it's for you to set up policies that maintain confidentiality for your staff, but then at the same time, give you a way to know that a report has been filed, and for you to be aware that you may need to protect your staff, that an angry parent may come in, that staff may be confronted, or they may want to talk to you if you're the director of the program. Next slide. Again, I give this scenario. I told you before about the one case where there was a gang member that we were aware of that was related to the person that made a threat. We went to court. We got a temporary restraining order against that person coming to our center. but we also took extra steps to ensure that staff and children felt safe. We hired an off-duty police officer. You may look at, and again, this was not for a long-term basis, but we wanted staff to feel safe. We wanted the parents to feel safe bringing their children. Just so you know, it's not on this slide, but just in terms of a general communication, when you have an issue like this, while we didn't disclose specifics about the concern and the case involved here, what we did do was we wanted to let parents know of why there was an off-duty police officer armed outside the program. So we let parents know as soon as we implemented this, having this person there, we let parents know so that parents could make a decision as to whether they wanted their child in the program on those days when we had security there. And again, we want parents to be able to make independent decision, but we also wanted to notify them that we were most concerned about their child's safety and that that's why we had that person there. Next slide. And again, I've just mentioned that what I was talking about there in terms of maintaining confidentiality. And if there were any specific threats, we would have also let the parents know about that. Again, we let the parents know so that if they make the decisions for their child ultimately when we feel like there could have been some threat to the program. And these are examples I'm not going to go through, and I want to check on time again, Kamna or Shireen.
Yes, Alan, you will need to wrap up.
So, and this is exactly what I was going to say. I put these concerns and anecdotes, they're in the handout. That's for your information, something you may want to use for discussion or for trainings at your programs. And I want to thank you for your time today, and I appreciate you taking this information and hopefully, again, protecting children when you suspect that they're being abused.
Thank you, Alan. We're going to get to my first slide. And I just really want to let you know that there's always hope. And after report, we now have a safety net of people that are going to help the child get through this situation. So let's look at the next slide. And in some states, including North Carolina, Florida, Illinois, and Texas, there are volunteers that are appointed by family courts to investigate cases and to be a voice for children in court. So as Kamna mentioned, I'm from North Carolina and I took on this role. And so in other states, the state will actually pay lawyers to advocate for children. And sometimes that works really well for children and sometimes it doesn't. So the advantage of having a volunteer is that I don't have any other lawyer friends that would be in the courtroom. And I am an objective person that is not, going to side with anyone except for the child. And so my role is to visit the children at least once a month. Now, sometimes if there's an issue, I go and see them more than once or call on the phone. And then I'm allowed to request to see any type of paperwork that I think is relevant to making sure kids are safe and also doing well. So if they're in elementary school or in a preschool or in a Head Start or even a child care center, I might ask for some records. And I can also see medical records and other court reports if things have happened in the past. And I've even gotten dental and optometry records. And at one point, I even got an electricity, a statement from an electricity company just to make sure bills were getting paid. So those are things that I was able to get. And then we usually go to court about every 3 months. And before that court hearing, I write a report, and if I can go to court, great. If not, there's a guardian ad litem supervisor that goes and makes sure that everything in the report is heard by the judge. And so let's look at the next slide. I want you to know that the ultimate goal is never, ever, ever to break up families. And so most of the time, parents have the opportunity to work toward reunification when children have been removed from their care. And so what will they have to do? Well, and many times they just have to follow some court orders, and maybe they might have to find some housing or maintain employment or complete psychological evaluations and follow recommendations. Maybe they have to attend a series of parenting classes or drug treatment or get some health practitioners to treat them themselves. So there's just a variety of things that could be put in place to make sure that it is safe for a child to return home. Next slide. So in North Carolina, we want to have permanency for children within a year. I'm going to tell you that generally, that is always the goal, but it's been looking like an average of 18 months, to be honest. So when we get a case, we want to either return kids to their parents, establish somebody in their life to be their guardian, or figure out a way for the child to get adopted. And options 2 and 3 are used when it's not safe to return the children to the parents, or their parents are just unable to care for them for a variety of reasons. So guardianship care, the children have to be living with that person in North Carolina for at least 12 months. And adoption, of course, is something, totally different, but we want to make sure that we've given people the time to try to fix things, and before adoption can take place, the rights of parents are terminated. So let's move on to the next slide. So when children are in the system, there are a variety of different places that they can be cared for. Now, sometimes they're put into what we call in North Carolina kinship care, and that's where a family member or very, very good family friend will take on the responsibility of taking care of that child and letting that child live with them. And their home is approved by social services to be safe, and they have established that they have enough money to take care of the child or children that are placed with them. And they're willing to take on that responsibility, knowing that they're not going to get probably any money at all from parents or even the system, because in some states, including North Carolina, there's no monetary stipend for kinship care. Now, foster care, the families that do foster care have to attend a series of classes. I've heard anywhere from 8 to 11 classes, depending on how long they are. And every adult in the house has to attend and be certified by their county to care for the children. And in these cases, these families that have agreed to do this care, they're not looking to get rich because they're receiving a small monthly stipend. And that's really to offset the cost of providing care, because when you have more people, you use more electricity, water, food. There might, of course, be needs to buy clothes if you're getting an infant, and there might be diapers to buy and things like that. Now, often kids under 5 will also be able to get on WIC if they're in foster care or in kinship care. So there is that stipend of money. Also, we have group homes. Now, some children have mental health issues and are unable to be placed in a regular foster home. So there could be a therapeutic home or even a group home that will take on those children. And in some cases, we have older children that are in their teens and they're harder to place, and they're often sent to group homes. Now, group homes have 6 or more children. They may have several cottages of children. I've seen some really big ones. And they have 24-hour staffing, so people stay awake through the night to make sure everybody's being safe. Now, our fourth option here is for children to remain with their parents, and sometimes that happens, but the parents are going to get visits often by the social worker, the guardian ad litem, just to make sure that things are moving along the way they're supposed to. So they're parents in need of extra support, but maybe they're still trying really hard and they're able to still care for their kids, and it's still safe for the kids to live there. So it's just being monitored. So let's look at the next slide. We have to know that children are learning that each place that they have to go to has a new set of rules. And so they might have a new foster home, a new school, a new early learning center, and it's really hard for them to keep all those rules straight. So I really ask you to be patient with the children and prepare to offer additional explanation sometimes. And one of the strategies that I've found helpful in the past is appointing another child to be their buddy for the day, to show the new student around the room, show them what to do during transitions and at cleanup time. And of course, that can only be accomplished depending on the age of the children in the room. Let's look at the next slide. So Alan had a slide earlier that talked about some common behaviors of abused children, and I just really want to reiterate a few of them. So there's definitely some children that have withdrawn or a depressed mood, or they have lots of anger or lack impulse control, and you can see there's other factors on this list. But please know that this list by any means does not include all the behaviors seen by abused children, and we might see some other things. But we also sometimes have children that have already developed a lot of resilience and might not have exhibited any of these behaviors. They might seem to be just doing fine, but know that even if they're doing fine, they're coping with it. However, they still might have some things that come to light that make them feel a little scared or frightened because they have been traumatized in some ways. So let's move to the next slide.
And this should be a poll question. So the question is, have you or your family ever been directly impacted by child abuse? And I believe our options are yes or no. So if you would take a couple of seconds here, go ahead and answer this. Have you or your family ever been directly impacted by child abuse? We'll take another couple of seconds to answer that one. All right, let's finish this up, and then we'll check our answers to see what we have. So 34% have had, so over a third of you have had been directly impacted by child abuse from someone through your family members somehow. So that's I think consistent with some of the statistics that Alan has been showing us about how widely spread it is and what some of those issues are. So I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie to talk about some of those strategies.
Thank you, Tony. So yes, we definitely want to look at some strategies to help you when you're working with children that have been abused. So we know that the way children cope depends on their age and personality. So some of these strategies may be helpful, and sometimes they're not helpful. But remember that this child or the children that have gone through this have a team in place. So, and many times they have a therapist, and sometimes I've even sent a note to the therapist asking for further advice and gotten some feedback. So keep that in your back pocket. Let's look at the first strategy on the next slide. Thank you. So time alone. You know, even as an adult, I need time alone. And so if we can just have a place in our classroom, and a lot of you now have a cozy center or another spot where one child can be alone to read a book or listen to some music, that is a great thing to have in place for children. Let's look at the next strategy. So if we have children that are old enough to write and journal, we could maybe give them the opportunity to do that. Now, I know I've talked about the sadness jar in an earlier webinar that I've done, but this really is a great strategy. We have a plastic jar in the room, and if a child is sad, they can get a teacher to write why they're sad on an index card or write it themselves if they're old enough. And then they can fold it up and put it in the sadness jar. That way, their feeling is validated. And we definitely want to always validate feelings because they're important. Next slide. So I know that when I'm stressed out, it's really hard for me to sit still and listen to information. So I always remember that when I'm trying to have circle time and I see kids moving around. And we know that sometimes people just can't sit still without a stress ball or a fidget. So if you don't have stress balls, sometimes you can pick them up at conferences and just kind of hold on to them until you need them. Or you can give children Play-Doh to just mush in their hand, kind of like a stress ball. But I also like to do quiet fidgeters, and sometimes I just tie old material together, different textures, and then I hand them out during circle time so that kids can just play with them. Next slide. So breathing in deep is really a good strategy to help people relax and calm down. And so some of the ways that we can get kids to breathe in deep are by blowing bubbles or pinwheels. So I prefer to have the bubbles outside and the pinwheels inside, but of course, you know, some classrooms are okay with the bubbles inside. It's just really a great strategy to have a child take a deep breath and blow out slowly so those bubbles will move or the pinwheel will turn. Next slide. On the next slide, we're looking at the Open the Other Senses game. So I'm sure many of you have had to close your eyes and think of a quiet, great place that you really like and think about all the sounds that you hear and what you feel and what it smells like and what do you taste. And we could do the same thing for children. You know, we can ask them to think about the beach that they just went to a couple of weeks ago and close their eyes and recount what they heard and saw and felt and what they smelled and tasted there. And that can really help them open their other senses and feel a little bit more relaxed about things. Next slide. In one of my programs, we actually had the older school-age children doing knitting and crocheting. And it was just like a mini course that we brought in, but we ended up realizing that it helped the kids relax. And first the girls were just doing it, but then when they started selling what they made, the boys got involved too. And it was definitely a great thing to use your hands for. And for younger children, you could use a geoboard or weave yarn. It's just an excellent way to concentrate on something else and finish a task. So on the next slide, we're going to look at arts. Now, I know that Music and art therapy are now very, very big, but they also cost a lot of money. Therefore, if we have things for children, painting, water, watercolors, coloring, they can start to use their arts to work through some of their stressful times. And it's just a really great thing to offer for kids. Let's look at the next slide. So you don't have to be a professional yoga instructor to give children time to stretch and breathe in and out deeply. I'm sure that most people have been to a gym class during high school where you had to stretch before you did the sport, whatever you were playing. And so we all kind of know how to stretch some of our muscles, or if not, we can look that up on YouTube. It's just a really great thing to have some time to just move slowly and focus and relax. Next slide. Any type of exercise, including sports, is a great way to pump endorphins. And endorphins are the feel-good transmitters in those brains. So we want to make sure that kids do have the time to exercise. Next slide. So in nature, we have very calming sounds. We have the ocean, we have rain, we have wind blowing, and sometimes just sitting outside and relaxing and listening to those sounds can be really calming. And now we also have apps that can play those sounds. So think of that if you need a way to help kids relax. Next slide. On the next slide, we need to look at remembering that all children are going to need patience and understanding from their caregivers and teachers. Some of their behaviors might be intolerable, but we should always very much try to remain calm and just very supportive. We have to, if we look at the next slide, we have to really get to know children and start with small talk, do board games, read books, do puzzles, but don't ever ask about abuse because it's not your job, it's the role of the therapist or the social worker. And the next slide, once we started to get to know the child, we can start to develop trust. And in this case, when children want to tell us something, they will. But remember to show children that you can be trusted by following through on the things they ask you to do. In the next slide, after you develop trust, you have a relationship with kids. And so you don't want to ruin that relationship. And we want to make sure that you continue to have that relationship even if the child moves out of your room. Remind them that they're still important to you. Relationships don't happen overnight, and they need to be cared for. Next slide. Children already have a lot of change in their life, so we know that there's often turnover in childcare. So if you're the administrator, really think about who you're placing the child with, which classroom the child's going to go with. Make sure it's a teacher that has been with your program for a while and is not going to leave soon. Sometimes when we hire new staff, they think they want to be in the field, but they leave, and we're not sure whether or not they're coming or going, and we just want to make sure that kids have that continuity of care within the early learning center if possible. And next slide. We can help parents develop resilience and offer them resources around the community, and also help them increase their social connections. And we can do this real easily by just knowing what's going on in our community and where we could possibly refer parents to if they're having some needs that need to be met, and also having, events within our center so parents can meet other parents and start to have those social connections. Next slide. So we also know that it's important to help parents learn about parenting, and sometimes when you have those social events, parents can see other people parenting, and they can get some advice just by observing, and they often find other people that can support them in their times of needs. So, and of course, one of our big roles as providers is to make sure that we're always building social emotional intelligence for kids so that they can build resilience. So on our next slide, I believe we're looking at our references. Before that, I just want to remind you that if you do suspect child abuse, to always report it. You can really change somebody's life and make it better. Let's look at the next slide. In your handout, you're going to notice that there are some resources, and of course, there are tons of resources on the internet, but these are some of them that we use today to develop this webinar for you. And I'm going to hand this back over to Kamna, and she can tell you about how to get your webinar certificate today.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you to all the presenters for really sharing a great deal of information today with our audience. We really hope that you all who have joined us today benefited from this session. So for those of you who would like to receive a certificate of participation, please access your certificate right now from the handout section. Please know that you have to be logged in both by audio and video to receive a certificate. So we did make sure that we included this message on our registration form, as well as on the other emails that went out, and we would like to also mention that to receive a certificate or access your certificate from the handout section, you need to be logged in both by audio and video. And so please go ahead and do it now. It's there. While you're doing that, I also want to mention about our next webinar. Our next webinar is going to be on childhood trauma. We will again have someone with expertise on this topic join us. Tony is one of the presenters who will be doing the webinar along with one of our other colleagues, Mary Braxton. So this is scheduled for Wednesday, October 23rd. So please mark your calendar. But if you are already on our email list, you will certainly receive an email about this webinar. And for those of you who would like to be on our email list, please do go to our website, www.sourceforlearning.org/ECEI. And again, would like to remind you to spread the word about these webinars on Facebook, on Twitter. And if you need to connect with us regarding our free webinars, also here is the email. So if for some reason when you go to our website and you can't figure out where to sign up, just send us an email, and we'll be happy to put you on our list. So we certainly appreciate it. It's a little past 2:30, but we thank you so much for joining our session today. There will be a very brief survey which will really take about 2 minutes once we end this webinar, so I would greatly appreciate you provide us with your comments, or it will even come into your the follow-up email. So feel free to do that at a later time. But certainly your feedback helps us improve our session. So again, I thank all the presenters here today. Thank you very much for sharing a great deal of information, and thank you all who joined us today, and hope to see you again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.